Hello dear friends. Today we will see the story of Gottried von Bismarck, a German soldier who witnessed the horrors of the Battle of Stalingrad. Gottried von Bismarck was born on January 8, 1921. After obtaining his school-leaving certificate in 1939, he performed his compulsory RAD labor service, and during the Polish campaign was a soldier training in civil engineering. From October 1939, he did his basic military training with the 9th Infantry Regiment at Potsdam before being drafted to the 176th Regiment in the 76th Infantry Division. After the French campaign, he attended the War Academy and obtained his commission in January 1941. Afterwards, he served with a training unit in Romania and the Russian front. That meant for us infantrymen a march on foot of about 950 kilometers through dust, or after the slightest rainfall, deep mud, weighed down with all our battle gear, 70 kilometers daily. Many of us were able to sleep while marching, taking a position in the middle of the column and being pushed in the right direction on the bends. I could even sleep running. Because as platoon commander I had to lead from the front, I used to hold the tail of the company commander's horse to remain on course. The Russians offered heavy resistance only at the river crossings. Thus we reached the Donets basin rapidly, too rapidly, and were surprised there by the early onset of winter, stifling our advance. In that Russian winter of 1941, bitter defensive fighting alternated with periods of relative quiet. Both were hard to endure, for unlike the Russians, we had no winter clothing, and temperatures could fall to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Casualties due to frostbite were substantial. And so those who survived this winter were awarded a medal which we called the Order of the Frozen Meat. In the spring of 1942, we left our winter positions, and after great long marches and some bitter fighting to break out of encircling movements, we reached the Don. On August 21, our 178th Regiment broke through the northern bridgehead over the Don at Wrtiachi. And then our panzers, despite the stiffest Russian resistance, got through to the Volga north of Stalingrad in a few days. In September, my 76th Division had settled in the so-called northern boundary between the Don and Volga in steppe country with deep gorges, and dug in laboriously. A double trench system enabled us to reach all command positions from the bunkers. In front of our lines we laid 6 rows of minefields and barbed wire, and dug in behind them immobilized Russian T-34s with working turrets for defense against tanks. We had the feeling, here we are safe. Here the Russians cannot touch us. In Stalingrad itself, the fighting began man to man and house to house for every square meter, a struggle on the western banks of the Volga, where the Russians had dug in and were clinging to a slope 300 meters wide which fell steeply down to the river. Because the area being fought for was so narrow, there was no question of using heavy weapons here. In the end we never took this strip because we never managed to prevent the Russians keeping it supplied, and it was a struggle which often involved grotesque situations. Thus once I visited a company commander I had befriended in whose sector there was a house where the Germans were in the cellar and first floor and the Russians on the ground floor. Fearing the approach of winter, nobody wanted to demolish the house, but nobody wanted to give up the positions held. During the day there would be bitter fighting, but with humane features. Thus at night there was tacit agreement that a kind of truce would exist so that the wounded could be brought out and the fighting men supplied with rations. A serious problem for us as a horse-drawn unit was how to accommodate the horses out of the cold and provide their fodder. In the bald, barren steppe, no trees, no bushes, this was not possible. Even the wood to construct our underground bunkers had to be procured from hundreds of kilometers away on the other side of the Don. Our horses had to be sent back over the river, except for the small number needed for the supply carts. The catastrophic outcome of this measure was that later when we were building up the pocket and had to pull in the flanks, we lost nearly all our heavy guns because we could not move them without the horses. In November 1942, in our sector on the Stalingrad flank, it was relatively quiet, and the army lifted the ban on furloughs. So now there was leave. We drew lots and I got Christmas, but then an elderly reserve officer came and asked me to change with him. He had almost immediate leave, but had just received news that his daughter was getting married at Christmas. I was quite prepared to change. As a practical soldier, I said to myself, you have what you have. Who knows if this leave-taking will last until Christmas or whether you will be still alive to see it. Therefore, okay, and off home. 2 days later, on November 15th, I sat in the leave train at Kalich, last station on the Stalingrad line. The railway bridge over the Don was still down. On November 19th, only 4 days later, the Russians launched their major offensive. And on 22nd, they bottled up the Sixth Army. I had a wonderful, peaceful 4 weeks of leave on our estate. It was the last time that I knew my Pomeranian home. Because the press and radio were silent on the situation in Stalingrad, neither I nor the lower military command centers, and certainly not the German people, had any hint of the catastrophe that was building there. Had my reserve battalion at Potsdam, which I visited before I left for the front, even heard it rumored about the true situation, they would definitely have tried to hold me back. But they had no reason to do so, because of the lack of information. Therefore, when my leave ended on December 14th, I took the eastbound train from Berlin. When the train stopped at Kharkov, the order came, officers and men of the Sixth Army alight. Officers to the Führer Reserve. We had no hint of what that meant, but word gradually got around that something was not right at Stalingrad. We accepted it with the stoic calm of the veteran soldier. That the Sixth Army could be encircled was unimaginable. After a few days at Kharkov, we moved to the Führer Reserve at Rostov-on-the-Don, where rumors of a pocket at Stalingrad were rife. I was given orders to act as liaison officer with the Romanian army, together with about 40 other officers, with orders to report to the most far-flung command centers. We were sent off by train from Rostov to the east. I had to find the Romanian army. I was unable to find out exactly where their army staff was located. As I discovered later, at this point in time it no longer existed, not to mention Romanian forces. All Romanians, except for those trapped in the pocket, had fled west in panic, leaving all their weapons and equipment behind. At Chur, about 280 kilometers from Stalingrad, we received orders that the men aboard this present train were to form a battle group to defend the town. The ratio of men to officers in this battle group was about 6 to 1. The officers, all made platoon commanders irrespective of their rank, carried the heaviest weapons we had, namely, our pistols. The NCOs and men had only their sidearms. The men were mainly members of the Sixth Army supply units, bakers, ostlers, drivers. Therefore soldiers without any combat experience, which made the whole exercise senseless. That was on December 23rd. Next day also we camped in the, thanks be to God, heated train at the station platform because nothing else was available, and from there we defended Chur. No enemy showed up. We had no inkling of the overall military situation, but it was clear to us that not even here, 280 kilometers this side of Stalingrad, was there a functional defensive front. We got confirmation of this from an ambulance train heading westwards on the neighboring track. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve, and none of us had thought of it. These were the last wounded flown out of the pocket to Morosovskia and loaded in goods wagons there, just a few hours before the Russians captured the airfield. When I saw the haggard and wounded, fed only the barest essentials, on the straw in the goods wagons, I suddenly remembered my Christmas tree, which my mother had given me to celebrate Christmas on the steppe and which I had brought along with me in a large sack, contrary to all common sense. It was cold with a biting frost, but no wind, and so we quickly set up the Christmas tree on the station platform and lit candles on it. Soldiers and the walking wounded gathered around it, at first hesitantly, others opened the doors of the goods wagons. Some began to softly hum Silent Night, Holy Night, others joined in. It was a rough-hewn, very moving choir. Afterwards it fell quiet, very quiet. We were all alone with our thoughts, far, far from here. Then someone started up with another well-known German carol and all joined in almost fervently. Despite everything, hope gleamed eternal. Seldom before had a Christmas evening and a Christian message moved me so deeply and filled me with so much confidence as on that night. Over the next few days we played at soldiers, so to speak, simply to sort out who was who. I recall 2 reconnaissance patrols, for officers in an Opel P4 in an icebound street. Armament, 4 pistols. The other was in a locomotive with a Russian driver. Russian firemen and 3 officers scouting the railway line ahead to the east. This was also totally ridiculous and not a little dangerous because the Russians used to fly over by night in their sewing machine, a slow fighter bomber. We always had 2 tanker wagons full of fuel on these runs. On December 30th I got new orders. I was to return to Army Group Don at Novocherkassk and report to the registry which had received a request from my division in the pocket, where practically all officers of the original permanent company were casualties. After the turbulent to and fro of recent days I was happy to return to my own unit even if it was encircled for the moment. The idea that the situation could become critical or even hopeless did not occur to me because I assumed that officers were continually being flown in. My flight was scheduled for the next day. Looking through the composition of the staff I noticed that a cousin of my sister-in-law, Alexander Stahlberg, whom I knew well, was personal adjutant to Manstein. I rang him and he said, "Come at once. The field marshal is having his midday nap." We had just started our happy family chat when suddenly, unexpectedly early, Manstein appeared. I reported myself, he asked who I was and where I was bound. To my reply, from the so-called defensive front on the way to Stalingrad, he cut in, "What do you mean by so-called defensive front?" To my rather forward response, "Do you wish to know exactly, Herr Field Marshal?" He ordered me to take supper with him and his staff to make my report. It was the only time that a mere second lieutenant had been invited to dine within this noble circle. Manstein mentions this evening in his book Verlorene Siege, as does Stahlberg in Die Verdammt Pflicht. Stahlberg wrote that it was my Prussian devotion to duty which motivated me to return to the pocket. That sounds good, but is untrue. I was a soldier, had my orders, and had to carry them out. Next morning I was taken to the airfield and shown an He-111 bomber. The bomb bays were crammed with bread and ammunition and the wings full of fuel for the vehicles in the pocket. The airfield was a simple meadow without a runway. Because of the unevenness of the terrain and the gross overloading, the undercarriage collapsed shortly before takeoff and the aircraft slid hundreds of meters on its belly. By some miracle it did not burst into flames. The 3-man crew and I were unhurt. So, back to the flight office for the next attempt. There I met a Luftwaffe officer I knew. He said, "You're crazy, flying into the pocket. I've got a courier flight to Berlin. Come with me, tonight we'll have a coffee at Kranzler's." This was the first time my Prussian devotion to duty had been put to the test. I declined and arrived punctually for the second takeoff attempt. It was a flight of 3 machines without fighter escort. None of our fighters was available. We were attacked by Russian fighters and the other 2 machines were apparently hit. They did not attempt to land, but discarded their cargoes. Our aircraft put down. As soon as one of our machines arrived, the Russian artillery would bombard the airfield. There was therefore no time to lose. Quickly out, unload, wounded aboard, and then take off again. It was very dangerous to be anywhere near the airfield. Many men had been hit by cargo jettisoned from the air. Even bread is pretty hard when frozen solid. I hastened to get away from the place. I think I was one of the last officers to be flown in. A few days later, the Russians captured this airfield. I was taken to my division, reported to the commanding officer and passed him Manstein's message as I had been instructed, namely that the situation was a miserable one, but not hopeless. He gave me strict orders not to make this judgment by the commanding general known. I replied that I could not keep it quiet. I considered it unreasonable and psychologically wrong to pretend to the fighting troops that the situation was other than what we knew it was. That night I was taken to my regiment at the front where, 30 kilometers west of Stalingrad in the steppe, they had set up a provisional defensive line. The regiment still consisted of only 2 battalions each with 2 battle groups. Apart from the regimental adjutant, I never met an officer of the original corps staff. There were just the 6 of us when our strength should have been 45. I took command of a battle group with about 30 men. My predecessor had been seriously wounded the day before. I met nobody from my old pioneer platoon, they had all fallen. It was difficult to lead a squad whose members I did not know and with whom I only had contact at night because they were located in dribs and drabs in trenches on the flat, snow-covered steppe. One could only move about when the moon was not visible or under thick overcast. Food, when there was any, was brought up by night to the battle group command post, a hole covered over by aircraft parts, illuminated by diverting a telephone cable. Our well-constructed positions were now occupied by the Russians, while we on the other hand were on the open steppe, where we had had to scrape out holes in the frozen ground from under a meter of snow and in temperatures of -15 to -20 degrees Celsius. What was the situation in the pocket? What had changed in Stalingrad during my absence over the last 6 weeks? The army was now starving, there were no reserves of provisions. Nowhere near enough could be supplied from the air. Gradually the rations got less and less until finally one had to scavenge for food. The increasingly desperate situation worsened the plight of the wounded and sick. Even the most basic medical materials were lacking: bandages, medication, narcotics, not to mention warm bunkers. The wounded and sick in the pocket had almost no chance of survival. Therefore every wounded man who could crawl tried to seize a place in an aircraft, if necessary, by brute force. This led to ghastly scenes at the airfield. The fuel the aircraft brought in was not even enough for the couple of still operational panzers to get back into action. There was no fuel for the ambulances. As far as possible, the wounded had to be retrieved and transported by sledge. The last of the horses were useless as carriers and insufficient in numbers as a reserve for food. Yet the worst of all was the lack of practically any ammunition, either for light or heavy weapons. Such artillery as there was required the approval of the divisional commander for every round fired. The chances of beating off a Russian attack in these circumstances, something with which we had to reckon daily, were very slim. That, then, was Stalingrad on January 4, 1943, no possibility of getting a bit of warmth. No chance of survival for the wounded, no ammunition, no weapons to fight off Russian tanks, no prospect of relief from outside the pocket. It was and remains a marvel that the men were still willing to fight on under these circumstances. On January 8 I was 22 years of age. And on January 10 the end began. The enemy launched a massive attack from the north. We succeeded in holding our trenches for a whole day, then the Russians near us broke through and in order not to be cut off we had to pull back in the face of a strong enemy force. Night by night a little bit further east, closer to Stalingrad. By day one half of my squad slept. The other half had to try to keep the advancing Russians at bay. On the marches to the rear each night, every vehicle found immobile was ransacked for anything edible. If we were lucky, and something was found, it would be shared around. The trouble was, whenever something to eat was found, my battle group would suddenly grow in size to over 100 men. In the darkness it was difficult to pick out my own. We towed the wounded on makeshift sledges through the deep snow. Otherwise, we could do nothing, our own strength did not extend to anything else. Each night we discussed if and how one might make his way through to the west. I knew how far away the nearest German troops were and therefore condemned every idea, alone or in groups, as totally hopeless. Hundreds of kilometers of snow-covered steppe, hardly any chance of hiding oneself, no chance of finding anything to eat, and because of the months of hunger no reserves of strength to endure a forced march of that length. We gave up the idea. Some tried it all the same, but none made it. Meanwhile it was clear to us all that every man of us who survived had to reckon with being made a prisoner of the Russians, but it was never spoken of openly. We could all remember the dreadful sight of the endless columns of half-starved, apathetic, resigned Russian prisoners of war, and none of us could or would imagine the tables being turned on us like that. Meanwhile, the pocket had been divided up into 3 parts. We had no airfields any longer and accordingly no line of supply. By night aircraft dropped containers of food, whoever found one kept it. A large number of these containers fell into the hands of the Russians. On January 31st, the southern pocket under Paulus surrendered. The day before he had been made a field marshal and had called upon us to fight to the last round. We in the northern pocket held out. It was a macabre thing to sit in the cellar of a wrecked house in the ruins of Stalingrad listening to our obituary. This was Göring's famous eulogy in which he compared us with the Spartans who had knowingly sacrificed their lives defending a strategically decisive isthmus against a superior Persian force in order to halt them. When Göring in concluding his speech quoted the last message of the fallen Thermopylae warriors, "Wanderer, come to Sparta and tell them you have seen us lying dead as the law required," then we knew that we had finally been written off. A whole army, sacrificed for nothing. We could not credit it. The embitterment was boundless. On February 2nd it was all over. The shooting stopped. Prisoners were taken quietly without any excesses by the conquering troops. Tacit understanding for the defeated enemy? Both sides were sick to death of it and happy that it was finally over. At the end of December 1949, in a mock trial on trumped-up charges, Gottried von Bismarck was sentenced to 25 years labor camp. The basis of the arraignment was the fact that Soviet prisoners of war had been required to work on his family estate in Pomerania. He spent the next 5 years in hard, forced labor underground. In 1955, after almost 13 years of captivity, he was freed as a result of the efforts of Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. In vain, together with others, he attempted to have the West German Federal Republic recognize those condemned to forced labor to be victims of Stalinism and compensated financially. It hurts that this should fall on apparently deaf ears amongst our politicians. He studied at the Essen School of Mining, worked as a blaster with Tyson's, sinking shafts, and finally set up his own business exporting to the East. He died on January 8, 2001. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you next time.